Silence has many meanings. For some, it is peace. For others, it is fear. For the girl, silence was both prison and protection. From the moment she could walk and understand the world around her, her life was painted not with laughter, but with shadows. In her earliest memories, the house was always quiet, yet it was never calm. The stillness was suffocating, like heavy air pressing against her small chest. Her father's presence filled every corner, not with warmth, but with authority that demanded obedience without words. He did not need to raise his hand often. The threat of what could happen was enough. His gaze alone taught her the language of silence. At family gatherings, other children her age would chatter endlessly, chasing each other, telling jokes and singing songs. She would sit in a corner, her small hands clenched tightly together, lips sealed. Relatives tried to coax words out of her. Say hello. Tell us your name. What do you want to be when you grow up? But her eyes would lower, and her throat would refuse to open. At first they thought she was shy. Then they believed she was mute. Some even said she was cursed. But no one understood that silence was not her choice. It was the armor she built to survive. Every child seeks comfort from their parents, but her home was not a place of comfort. The walls carried secrets. At night, when the world outside was asleep, she would hear the sound of dragging, heavy thuds, sometimes muffled cries that stopped too suddenly. She would squeeze her eyes shut, pulling the thin blanket over her head, pretending that she heard nothing. Silence was safer than asking questions. Her mother had left when she was too young to remember, leaving her father as the only figure of authority in her life. To outsiders, he was strict but respectable. He wore clean clothes, greeted neighbors with polite nods, and paid bills on time. But behind closed doors, he was a man who controlled with fear. He would whisper threats that clung to her mind like chains. Do not speak. Do not ask. Do not tell anyone what happens here. If you do, you'll end up like them. She never knew exactly who them was, but her imagination filled the silence with terrifying possibilities. At school, her teachers marked her down as special needs. They thought she was incapable of speech. They offered her flashcards, writing boards, even therapy sessions, but she stayed quiet, not because she could not speak, but because words felt like dangerous weapons that could bring punishment upon her. Children teased her, calling her ghost girl, broken doll, and sometimes even poked her to see if she could cry out. But she didn't. Tears came, yes, but her lips remained sealed. What her classmates never knew was that silence had made her sharper than most. She saw what others overlooked. She noted small details, the twitch of her father's eyes when someone asked him too many questions, the smell of chemicals on his clothes, the nervous way he shut the curtains at certain hours of the night. She was silent, but her mind was awake, absorbing everything like a sponge. Her bedroom became her sanctuary. There, she kept a small notebook where she scribbled sketches and notes. At first, they were innocent, drawings of trees, birds, and the moon. But slowly, the notebook turned into her secret witness account. She wrote down the dates of when people came to the house, and she would mark an X for each one who never came back out. There were 9 X's by the time she turned 13, 9 silent entries, 9 heavy secrets. Every night, she sat at her window, staring at the stars. She wondered if they could hear her thoughts, if the universe knew about the secrets buried beneath her floor. She longed to cry out, but fear pressed her throat shut. What if her father found out she had spoken? What if her words cost her life? Yet in her silence, a seed of resilience grew. She promised herself that if ever a moment came when her words could save someone, she would speak. Until then, she would wait, observing, remembering, gathering courage like a hidden flame. Her silent childhood was not wasted. It was the preparation of a voice that would one day shatter years of fear. She did not know it yet, but the same silence that once protected her would later make her words more powerful than she could ever imagine. For in silence, she learned patience. In silence, she learned observation. And in silence, she discovered that when the time was right, even a whisper could be louder than a scream. From the outside, her home looked ordinary. It stood on a quiet street, a 2-story building with faded paint and a rusted iron gate. To passing neighbors, It was just another house in the row, blending into the landscape of suburbia. But for the girl, that house was not a home, it was a cage. The curtains were always drawn, no matter if it was day or night. The sunlight was unwelcome inside those walls, as if her father feared that light might reveal his secrets. She grew up in dimly lit rooms, where shadows stretched longer than they should and silence hung heavier than air. The house seemed alive in its own way. The creaking of the floorboards felt like whispers, and the groan of the basement door was like a warning. Inside, every object had its place. Her father was meticulous. The living room was spotless, the shelves lined with neatly arranged books, and the furniture covered with stiff plastic as though visitors might arrive at any moment. But no visitors ever came, and if they did, they never stayed long enough for comfort. Some never left at all. The girl's bedroom was at the far end of the hallway, a narrow space with a single bed, a wooden desk, and a window that overlooked the backyard. That window was her only connection to the outside world, the only way she knew when the seasons changed. She often pressed her forehead to the cold glass and watched children play outside, their laughter floating up to her like music from another universe. But when night fell, the house changed. That was when the noises began. She would hear her father's heavy boots pacing across the floorboards, the sharp metallic clink of tools, and the dragging of something too heavy to be ordinary, sometimes muffled sounds, whimpers, groans, and then silence. Always silence. She would bury her face in her pillow, trying to block it out, but the house had a way of making every sound echo in her bones. The basement was the heart of the house, though she was forbidden to go near it. Its door was locked most of the time, but the smell that seeped through its cracks was unforgettable. It was a sickly mixture of bleach and something far worse, something rotten, something human. When she once asked, her father's glare was enough to freeze her. "Never go down there," he said in a voice so cold it silenced her curiosity forever. She noticed things no one else did. Over the years, she counted 9 people who had entered the house. Some strangers, some faces she vaguely recognized from the neighborhood. A woman with red hair who had come to sell magazines, a handyman who offered to fix the leaking roof, a young man her father claimed was a friend from work. She watched them walk in, but never walk out. She marked them in her notebook with trembling hands, 1X for each, 9X in total, like graves on a page. Even during the day, the house was suffocating. The walls felt too close, the air too stale. She imagined that the house itself was alive, swallowing people whole and keeping their voices trapped in the plaster and floorboards. Sometimes, when she sat very still, she thought she could hear faint whispers, a chorus of voices crying out for justice, echoing from the depths of the basement. Fear ruled her life inside those walls, but so did awareness. Every locked door, every chemical bottle hidden under the sink, every shovel leaning against the garage wall was a piece of a puzzle she was too afraid to put together. Yet her silence sharpened her memory. She became a silent archivist of horror, keeping track of her father's patterns. He left at night, always returning before dawn. He carried heavy bags in the house but never out. He cleaned obsessively, scrubbing the floors until they shone unnaturally bright. The girl often wondered what would happen if someone noticed, if the neighbors grew curious. But the house was built like a fortress of secrecy. The curtains denied outsiders a view. The locks on the doors discouraged visitors. And her father's calm, polite demeanor disarmed suspicion. To everyone else, he was just a strict man raising a quiet daughter. No one suspected that within those walls lay a graveyard of truth. Yet, in that dark house, something powerful was growing. While her father thought fear had silenced her completely, he did not realize that silence was giving her strength. She studied the house like a map, memorizing every sound, every pattern. She learned that darkness could not last forever, that truth had a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how much you tried to hide it. Each night, when the noises began again, she whispered silently to herself, "One day, I will speak. One day, this house will no longer hide his secrets." The dark house was more than just bricks and wood. It was a symbol of everything wrong, fear, secrecy, and control. But for the girl, it became the training ground for her courage. The house that silenced her was also the place where she discovered the value of her voice. She realized that when she finally broke her silence, her words would not just be sentences, they would be justice. The house was dark, yes, but she was the light waiting to shine inside it. For years, the girl's silence had been her shield. She had lived her life behind a wall of fear, never daring to cross the line her father had drawn. But every wall, no matter how strong, eventually cracks. And for her, the cracks began with a drawer. It was late one evening. Her father had just returned from one of his unexplained errands. She heard the familiar sound. The door shutting, the thud of his boots, the clatter of a shovel dropped carelessly in the garage. She was in her room, but curiosity tugged at her stronger than fear. That night, he seemed restless, pacing back and forth before finally retreating into his study. The door creaked as it shut, but he had forgotten something. He hadn't locked the drawer. When the house fell into uneasy silence, she tiptoed out of her room. Her heart raced, every creak of the floor sounding like thunder beneath her feet. The drawer in his study sat slightly ajar, almost inviting her. With trembling fingers, she pulled it open. What she saw made her entire body go cold. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were old, edges curling, while others were newer, still glossy. The faces in the pictures were unfamiliar, but the eyes haunted her. Smiling faces of men and women, frozen in moments of ordinary life. A young woman holding a child, a man wearing a uniform, a teenager with braces. But each photograph was marked, some with an X across the face, others torn in half. Her breath caught. She knew. Deep inside, she had always known. These were the people who had come into the house but never left. These were the lives her father had stolen. The 9 X's in her notebook were not just guesses. They were confirmations of something terrible and real. Her small hands shook as she touched the pictures. For the first time, silence was no longer enough. She realized her father's threats had kept her quiet. But what about these people? They had no voice now. Their families would never know what happened unless she spoke. The weight of that truth was heavier than her fear. Just then, she heard footsteps. Her father's boots. She shoved the drawer shut and ran back to her room, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She slid under her blanket, pretending to sleep, but her mind was wide awake. The images burned behind her eyelids. She had carried fear her whole life, but now she carried something stronger, responsibility. That night, she could not sleep. She sat at her desk, notebook open, staring at the 9 X's. Her silence had kept her alive, but now it was keeping others in the dark. The voices she thought she heard in the walls, the cries in the night. They were not just her imagination. They were the truth begging to be freed. The breaking point came with a single thought. If I do not speak, more faces will end up in that drawer. More X will cover these pages. More people will vanish. Her fear and courage wrestled inside her. One told her to stay quiet, to keep surviving. The other told her that survival without truth was not living. It was merely existing. By dawn, courage had won. The next morning, she dressed for school with trembling hands. She barely touched her breakfast, and her father, distracted as always, didn't notice the storm building inside her. On the walk to school, her legs felt like lead, every step heavy with decision. But she kept going. In the classroom, her teacher called roll as usual, her voice echoing in the silence. The girl sat at her desk, her hands clammy, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, but her body resisted. Years of silence don't break easily. But then she remembered the photographs, the faces, the eyes. She remembered the smell of bleach and rot from the basement. She remembered the 9 X. Her hand shot up. The entire class turned, shocked. This was the girl who never spoke. Even the teacher paused, disbelief written on her face. The girl stood, her knees trembling, her lips parted. At first, only a whisper came out, broken and fragile. But then, stronger, clearer, she said the words that would change everything. My father hid 9 bodies in our house. Gasps filled the room. The teacher's eyes widened, stunned into silence. For a moment, the weight of her confession hung in the air like thunder before a storm. But then action. The teacher rushed to her side, calming her shaking body, and immediately called the authorities. That moment, the breaking point, was the first time she had ever spoken in public. Her voice, though small, was more powerful than she could have imagined. It was the voice of justice, the voice of courage breaking free from years of chains. And as she sat in that classroom, tears streaming down her face, she realized something profound. Silence had not been her weakness. It had been her preparation. Every day of her silent childhood had built up to this moment, to the explosion of truth that would expose her father and bring peace to the souls buried in the dark house. The breaking point was not just about her father's secret being revealed. It was about her transformation. She was no longer the girl who never spoke. She was the girl who chose the hardest words at the hardest time and saved lives because of it. The classroom was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, stretching across the room until it presses on every chest. Dozens of eyes were fixed on her, the girl who had never spoken a single word in years of school. Teachers had tried everything to make her talk. Students had mocked, prodded, and whispered behind her back. But nothing had broken her silence. Until now, her voice had just escaped her lips, fragile but sharp like glass breaking in the quiet. My father hid 9 bodies in our house. For a moment, it felt like the world itself had stopped spinning. Her classmates froze, mouths open, pencils hovering mid-air. The teacher blinked rapidly, as though her brain needed time to process what she had just heard. And the girl stood there trembling, her throat raw, her palms sweating, her knees threatening to collapse beneath her. But she had spoken. After years of silence, she had spoken. The teacher rushed to her side, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "What did you say?" she asked softly, not in disbelief but in urgency. The girl's lips quivered. The fear she had lived with her whole life surged back like a tidal wave. She could almost hear her father's voice in her head. His threats, his commands, his warning never to speak. Yet for the first time, fear did not win. She took a shaky breath, her voice breaking but firm. "There are 9 bodies in our house. My father put them there." The teacher's face turned pale. The classroom erupted into whispers, some children gasping, others giggling nervously, not understanding the gravity of her words. But the girl kept her eyes locked on her teacher, as though handing her the secret she had carried for years. Within minutes, the school principal was called, then the police. The girl sat in the office, her small hands clenched tightly in her lap, while adults moved quickly around her. She felt as though she had cracked open the world, spilling truths too heavy for someone her age. Yet she did not regret it. For the first time in her life, her silence had been replaced with something greater, her voice. When the officers arrived, they spoke gently, careful not to frighten her further. They asked her to repeat what she had said. Her lips trembled, but the words came easier this time. Once the dam of silence was broken, the water of truth flowed. She told them about the noises in the night, the smell from the basement, the faces in the photographs, and the 9 says she had marked in her notebook. As she spoke, she realized something extraordinary. Her words had power. Each sentence was a strike against the prison her father had built around her. Each confession was a step closer to freedom, not just for her, but for the souls buried in that house. The officers exchanged grim looks. They did not doubt her. Children might imagine monsters under the bed, but no child imagines 9 bodies in the basement unless they've seen too much. That very day, a team was dispatched to her home. But in the school office, the girl waited. Her stomach knotted, her body shaking, her mind replaying the moment she had opened her mouth. For so long she had believed silence was safety. Yet here she was, alive, breathing and speaking. And the world hadn't ended. In fact, the world had begun to change. By the end of that day, news spread quickly. Authorities had uncovered horrifying evidence in her house. The whispers in the walls were real, the nightmares were real. Her father's secret had been dragged into the light. But the story that people would never forget was not just about the crimes. It was about her voice. A child who never spoke, who endured years of fear and silence, had chosen her moment with precision. And in a trembling whisper, she had toppled the fortress of lies her father had built. In the days that followed, she was interviewed by investigators, psychologists, and even reporters. People marveled at her bravery, but she did not feel brave. She felt small, fragile, and tired. Yet deep inside, she knew she had done something extraordinary. Her silence had not been wasted. It had been preparing her for this moment, this eruption of truth that would save lives and bring justice. At night, lying in her bed in a safe foster home far from the dark house, she replayed her first words again and again. They echoed in her mind, not as whispers of fear, but as chants of courage. My father hid 9 bodies in our house. Each time she remembered speaking them, she felt stronger, as if her voice was growing taller inside her. She realized something profound, that the first words you speak after silence carry more weight than 1,000 ordinary conversations. They become history. They become proof that even the smallest, most fragile voice can tear down walls of evil. Her first words were not about herself. They were about others, about the people who had vanished, about the families who never knew what happened, about the truth that deserved to be heard. That was what made them powerful. And so, the girl who had once been mocked for her muteness became an example of courage. Teachers told her story to other children, encouraging them never to be afraid of speaking the truth. Psychologists cited her case as proof that even the most silent souls carry thunder inside them, waiting for the right storm. Her silence had been her survival, but her words had become her victory. She was no longer the girl who never spoke. She was the girl who spoke when it mattered most. And in doing so, she saved herself, gave justice to the dead, and reminded the living that silence may protect you for a while, but words can change the world. The knock on the front door of the dark house was not like any other. It was sharp, commanding, and final. Police officers stood outside with warrants in hand, their eyes hard with suspicion. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering, wondering why law enforcement had swarmed the seemingly ordinary home of a man they thought they knew. Inside, her father tried to maintain his calm facade. He greeted the officers with polite composure, insisting they were mistaken, that his daughter was troubled, that her words were the inventions of a quiet, disturbed child. But the officers had heard her story, and there was a conviction in her trembling voice that no child could fake. They pushed past his protests and entered. The house felt colder than usual that day. The officers noticed the drawn curtains, the sterile neatness of the living room, and the faint, sour smell lingering in the air. One of them glanced toward the basement door, and their instincts sharpened. The key was found easily. It was hidden in the drawer she had once dared to open, the same drawer that had revealed the photographs. With a metallic click, the lock gave way. The door creaked open, exhaling a foul odor that confirmed what the girl had whispered in her classroom. The descent into the basement was slow, deliberate, each step an echo of dread. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams dancing across the concrete walls. At first glance, the basement looked ordinary. Boxes stacked neatly, old furniture covered in dust sheets. But the air was too heavy, the smell too strong. And then they saw it. A section of the floor was different. The concrete had been recently disturbed, uneven and patched in places. Tools, shovels, pickaxes, bags of lime lay nearby. The officers began to dig. Within minutes, the first horror was unearthed, a human bone, pale and unmistakable. Gasps filled the basement as the officers called for backup. Forensic teams arrived, bringing equipment, dogs and cameras. The quiet house that had kept its secrets for so long now became the center of chaos. One by one, the hidden graves revealed themselves. Beneath the floorboards, behind false walls, and under layers of soil, the truth emerged. The bodies of 9 victims, each silenced forever, were uncovered. Some had been there for years, others more recent, but each discovery confirmed the nightmare the girl had lived with silently for so long. Upstairs, she sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket, watching through the window as the house was torn open. Her heart pounded, her small fingers clutching the edges of the blanket, but she did not look away. For the first time, the whispers in the walls were not just hers to carry. The world was finally listening. Her father was handcuffed and led away, his mask of respectability shattered. Neighbors who had once waved at him in the mornings now stared in shock and disgust. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others wept, realizing the magnitude of what had been hidden so close to them. The man they had trusted, the house they had ignored, was a graveyard disguised as normalcy. The girl, though young, felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear, because the man who had controlled her life was still alive, still capable of looking at her with those cold, threatening eyes. Relief, because his power was broken. His secrets were no longer hers to guard. The truth had been unearthed, and with it, his reign of silence had ended. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the stories of the victims. Families who had lived with years of uncertainty, never knowing what happened to their loved ones, were finally given answers. The girl's testimony became the cornerstone of the case. Her silence had once made her invisible, but now her words made her indispensable. Without her courage, the truth might have remained buried forever. Counselors told her she was a hero, though she struggled to see herself that way. To her, she had simply done what she could no longer avoid. Yet as the trial began and the evidence mounted, people spoke of her with reverence. Reporters called her the girl who found her voice. Advocates for abused children cited her as proof that even the most powerless can change the world with a single act of bravery. The truth uncovered that day was not just about bodies in the basement. It was about the hidden darkness in ordinary places, the silence forced upon the vulnerable, and the strength it takes to break free. The girl's voice did more than expose her father's crimes. It became a warning, a message, and an inspiration. For every person living in fear, trapped in silence, her story was a reminder. See, truth cannot be buried forever. Lies may cover it for a time, but eventually the earth shifts, the walls crack, and courage finds a way to bring everything into the light. The dark house was no longer her prison. It was evidence. It was proof. And as she stood outside watching investigators carry out the remains, she whispered to herself, not in fear but in defiance, "You tried to silence me, but my words will outlive your shadows." News of the discovery spread quickly. It was in newspapers, on television, and across every social media platform. Headlines screamed of horror: 9 bodies found in suburban home, father arrested in shocking case of hidden murders. Yet behind the grim details, one part of the story captured the world's attention more than anything else. The girl. The girl who never spoke. The girl who lived in silence for years. The girl who broke that silence with a truth that exposed evil. Her story became bigger than the crimes themselves. It was no longer just about what had been buried in her home, but about what had been buried in her voice, her courage, her strength. And now that voice had risen, shaking the world awake. The message of her story was clear: silence does not mean weakness. For too long, people had mistaken her quietness for fragility, for incapacity. They had labeled her as mute, cursed, or broken. Yet in reality, her silence had been survival. It had been her shield against the cruelty of her father. But when the moment came, she used her voice not only to save herself, but to give justice to 9 souls who could no longer speak. Her message reached victims of abuse, of violence, of oppression everywhere. People who had been silenced by fear saw themselves in her. They understood that speaking up was terrifying, that it could feel impossible. But her story proved something powerful. Even the softest whisper could dismantle walls of evil when spoken at the right time. Organizations began telling her story to encourage children to speak out against abuse. Counselors cited her as proof that survivors could become heroes. Teachers told their students about the girl who never spoke, explaining that every voice matters, no matter how small. Her message was also for society at large. Too often, communities ignore the signs, the locked doors, the drawn curtains, the isolated child who never speaks. Too often, people look away, convincing themselves that everything is normal because facing the truth is uncomfortable. But her story forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they live in ordinary houses, wear polite smiles, and wave to neighbors in the morning. The girl's courage demanded a change in perspective. It reminded the world to look closer, to listen more carefully, to believe those who speak out, especially children. Her first words had not only brought justice in her own case, but had sparked a larger conversation about how silence is often imposed by fear and how important it is to create safe spaces where truth can be spoken. But the message went even deeper than crime and justice. Her journey symbolized something universal, that even when life forces us into silence, it is never permanent. Everyone carries a voice within them, waiting for the right moment to rise. And when it does, it can transform not only their own life, but the lives of countless others. For the girl, her silence had been a cocoon, painful, suffocating, but also protective, and her first words were like wings breaking free, fragile yet strong enough to lift her out of the darkness. That transformation resonated with people everywhere. Survivors of bullying, discrimination, injustice, and fear saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, and more importantly, a reflection of the strength they could one day find. She herself did not see her life as a grand symbol. To her, she was just a child who had endured too much and finally cracked under the weight of it all. But sometimes, ordinary people do extraordinary things simply by choosing truth over silence. And in doing so, they become symbols whether they mean to or not. Her message to the world was not complicated. It did not come in long speeches or carefully crafted words. It came in one trembling sentence. My father hid 9 bodies in our house. Simple, direct, terrifying, transformative. It showed that courage is not about never being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and speaking anyway. As she grew older, her story continued to ripple outward. She became a reminder that no matter how hopeless things feel, change can begin with a single act. No matter how powerless you think you are, your truth has weight. And no matter how loud fear screams, courage, even whispered, can silence it. The girl who never spoke was no longer defined by her muteness. She was defined by her moment of bravery. The world remembered her not for the years she spent in silence, but for the words she chose when it mattered most. And so, her story became a message etched into the hearts of all who heard it. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the pause before the storm. The one voice can save many. Even if it shakes, even if it trembles, it can still bring down walls of injustice. The fear is powerful, but truth is stronger. And truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. Her message was not just for victims. It was for everyone, for neighbors who hesitate to question what feels off, for teachers who overlook the silent child, for societies that prefer comfort over truth. It was a call to listen more, to care more, and to never underestimate the power of a single voice. The girl who never spoke became the girl who taught the world that words, once freed, can become weapons of justice, shields of protection, and seeds of change. And so, her silence, once thought of as emptiness, became the foundation for the most powerful message the world could hear. When you speak the truth, no matter how small your voice, you can save lives.